What would your life look like if you could learn any skill you wanted, quickly and deeply? Imagine becoming fluent in a language or a world-class public speaker in just a few months. Or if you could get an MIT-level education in less than a year, what would that do to your career? Well, in this book, the author has found people that have done all of these things and more. And by studying them, he started to uncover patterns in how they did it. And then by combining these patterns with his own learning and cognitive science research, he created what he calls Ultralearning, a strategy for acquiring skills and knowledge that is both self-directed and intense. In the book, the author reveals the 9 principles of ultralearning. He shows how real people have used these principles to become everything from world-class painters to grandmaster chess champions. Plus, he provides tactics that you can use to master each principle in your own projects. But this book isn't just about theory or research. The author successfully used these principles in his own projects. Everything from completing the MIT computer science course in less than a year to drawing realistic portraits in 30 days. In this video, we'll first discuss each principle and then go over the steps that you can take in your own ultralearning projects. The first principle is meta-learning, or learning how to learn. The better you are at learning, the more effective every hour you spend will be. So before you start a project, you need to do some research and create a clear plan for your learning. The author suggests using his why, what, how framework. First, identify why you want to learn the skill or subject so that you can tailor your learning to the parts that matter to you. And from there, break down what you need to know to reach your goal. And finally, carefully choose how you'll learn, including the resources, environment, and methods that you'll use. Your research should take about 10% of the total project time for longer projects and a little bit less for shorter ones. And the second principle is focus. Unsurprisingly, sustained focus is a real challenge for most people, but you can improve it over time. The simplest way to start improving it is to reduce 3 kinds of distractions. First, improve your learning environment by removing your phone and any other distractions. I actually have a whole video on this which I'll link in the description. Next, consider what kinds of tasks you find it easy to focus on naturally. If watching videos is easier for you than reading, use that to your advantage. And finally, your mind itself can be a source of distractions. Try to keep learning even when you're angry, stressed, or upset. The more often you do, the easier it will become. Next, we have directness. This third principle attempts to solve the issue of transfer, which the author describes as education's dirty little secret. Research has shown that humans are very bad at transferring things they've learned from one context to another. It's why being good at something in a classroom doesn't really translate to real-world abilities. And to combat this, you need to apply one of 4 techniques to your projects. Option 1 is to create a project with a goal, such as learning to code by creating a software program. Next, we have immersion. Put yourself in an environment where you can practice the skill automatically. For example, move to a country where they speak the language you're learning. And if a project or immersion isn't practical, you can use a simulation. For example, regularly speak to someone in another language on a video call. And finally, you can use overkill. Dramatically increase the challenge of your project so that you reach the skill level required during the project itself. For me personally, projects are always how I learn things. I learned to design and code by just starting to build things and then learning what I needed as I went. Doing it this way kept me super motivated, and it meant I could directly apply what I was learning in the real world. However, direct practice is only half of the equation. You also need to implement the 4th principle, drills. These exercises focus on just one aspect of a skill that's limiting your overall progress. There are 5 ways to create a drill. First, we have time slicing, focusing on just one part of the overall process. For example, just focusing on the hardest part of a song that you're learning to play. Second, cognitive components. Focus on only one mental aspect of the skill, like the tones if you're learning Mandarin. Next, we have the copycat. Copy someone else's work, changing only one part of it, so that you can focus on that. Next, the magnifying glass. Spend much more time focusing on one area of the skill. And finally, just start too early. You can start a skill that you're not ready for, and then when you struggle, go back and learn the basics with the extra context. So these principles will help you to learn quickly. But how are you going to remember all this new information? Well, this is where the 5th principle comes in, retrieval. Research has shown that trying to remember information that you've previously learned without a prompt is a great way to remember it long term. And again, the author has lots of methods to implement this. First, use flashcards. They can be either physical ones or using software. Or try free retrieval. After learning something, try to write down everything you remember on a blank piece of paper. Next, we have the question book method and challenges. As you're learning, write down test questions about it to answer later. Or, for more complex tasks, create entire challenges. And finally, closed book learning. Create a concept map of what you've learned, without the reference materials. And as you learn, you'll need a way to track your progress. And you can do this with the 6th principle, feedback. The more useful feedback you get, the quicker you can iterate your methods and improve your learning. There are 3 kinds of feedback. First, outcome feedback. Simply how well you're doing overall. Next, informational feedback. This is more useful and covers what you're doing wrong, even if it doesn't offer a solution. And finally, corrective feedback. This is the most useful of the 3 and explains your mistakes and how to improve them. Now earlier, we talked about how to improve your ability to remember the things you've learned. but unfortunately our brains still will forget things over time. Luckily, we can combat this with the next principle, retention. We can improve our chances of retaining information by using 3 approaches. First, spacing. Research shows that regular short sessions are better than occasional long ones. Next, proceduralization. Certain skills can become second nature after a while. For example, most people automatically know where the keys are on their keyboard, and this is because the knowledge has been moved to their procedural memory. To achieve this for your skill, practice the aspects that you want to retain more heavily than the rest. Next, overlearning. Similar to proceduralization, you can practice a skill even after mastering it to commit it to memory more deeply. So far we've spoken about increasing the breadth of your knowledge, but we haven't spoken about increasing the depth. This is your intuition. The deeper your knowledge is, the easier it will be to combine different facts and ideas to create unique solutions. The author has many rules for building intuition, which he's combined into a single approach called the Feynman Technique. Its name comes from a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who was famous for his intuition in maths and physics. Here's how it works. First, write down the concept or problem to solve at the top of a piece of paper. Then, explain it like you're teaching someone else. For a concept, explain it to someone who's never heard of it before. And for a problem, explain how to solve it and why that approach makes sense to you. When you get stuck, it means that your understanding is weak in that area. So go back to your learning materials and find the answer. And with that, we're down to the last principle, which is really the guiding principle for the entire book. Experimentation. You need to constantly test different learning, feedback and drill approaches to find what's best for you. And there's an interesting example for this principle, the artist Vincent van Gogh. Amazingly, he was too naturally ungifted to be accepted into formal art education. And despite this, through his process of aggressive experimentation, he created a style that's so unique that he became one of the most famous painters ever. Here are some of my favourite ways that the author suggests we can add experimentation in our own learning. First, copy, then create. Try to reduce the things you need to master by simply copying someone else. Next, try to use your skill using different techniques and compare the results. And finally, use constraints and extremes. To learn a skill more deeply, add constraints to your work or force yourself to only work in the extremes. For example, you could try to paint a picture using only one colour. So, now that we've talked about all the principles that guide an ultralearning project, let's talk about how you can create your own. And if you've watched this far, you can guess that the first step is research. You need to cover at least 5 areas. First, what you're going to learn. Try to be as specific as possible. Next, which resources will you use? Which books, courses or tutors will you select? Next, your benchmarks. Try to find out how other people have learned this in the past so that you know you're on the right track. Next, your direct practice. How will you practice in a real environment? And finally, your backup materials and drills. What other materials or methods might you use if your first ones aren't as useful as you hoped? Next, create a regular learning schedule. Define how long each session will be, when those will be each week, and for how long the project will last. And then put those into your calendar and stick to them. And from there, it's time to execute your plan. As you begin learning, you might uncover issues with your plan. You might notice that your plan relies too much on reading rather than retrieval, or the way that you're implementing it isn't very close to the real-world application. And that's okay. The important thing is to regularly revisit the principles of ultralearning and ask yourself if the plan is effectively using each of them. And if it's not, you should make some changes. You could switch resources, change your practice, or find new ways to get feedback and immersion. Whatever you do, remember to embrace the principle of experimentation so that you keep improving over time. When you finish your project, it's time to review it and decide what to do next. Not every project will go perfectly, but it's important that you learn from it regardless. You might find a specific resource wasn't as helpful as you'd hoped. Or, on the other hand, you might find a specific technique was amazing for getting feedback. The more projects you do, the more you'll find what works and what doesn't. And that is why learning from each project is essential, so that you keep improving your ability to learn over time. And once you've finished your project, you have 3 options as to what to do with your skill. The first is maintaining it, by committing to regular, minimal practice to keep your skill fresh. However, this is pretty time intensive, so you might choose to relearn it instead. Relearning is the process of allowing your skill to decay, but then quickly regaining it when you need it. Generally, relearning something is much quicker than learning it in the first place, so this can be quite time efficient. And the final option is mastery. Keep learning your skill or subject to keep building deeper and deeper knowledge. And this will happen pretty naturally if you use that skill professionally, because you'll be practicing it every day. One of the most interesting parts of learning is it's one of very few actions in the world that you can never finish. And more than that, the more you learn, the more you uncover that you've not yet discovered. And as you start to open a small crack in all the possibly knowable things that there are in the world, you might peer through and find out there's far, far more than you ever imagined.